I now invite Valerie Pearsall to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service, saying, Love is the doctrine of this church.
The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Precarious, hanging together. We don't know what our lives support. And we touch in the least shift of breathing. For you to touch another, or they to touch you, through a shift in breathing, is to touch through an intervening medium. If you've ever been out for a walk and felt a breeze hold your hand, you know how intimately that medium can be felt. Yet one would be hard-pressed to know what part of that sensation can be attributed to the least shift of breathing. I studied the Hebrew Scriptures with Professor Phyllis Tribble, and I remember her talking about breathing. I think in connection with the opening lines of Genesis, where it says that the Spirit or breath of God moved across the face of the waters. And she suggested that we don't control our breath. That if we try to take control of our breathing, we're soon out of breath. God is the breather, she said. I wouldn't put it that way. I think it's more nuanced than that, as anyone who has practiced a breathing meditation can attest. But her point was that the life that is in our bodies knows what sort of breathing it needs and demands it of us. If we run hard, we breathe heavy, and not by choice. Joseph Campbell made a similar point when he would say to an audience, I doubt there is anyone in this room who knows the exact chemical requirements to digest the breakfast you ate this morning, and yet you're doing it. And who else? Precarious, hanging together, we don't know what our lives support, and we touch in the least shift of breathing. That's true at the interpersonal level, and it's true of us collectively as a society. 2 weeks ago, I talked about how a now lost notion of households as economically productive institutions persists as a cultural idea even as the growth of industry increasingly has marginalized them. Though implicit in Adam Smith's 18th century writings, the household's productive character was gradually forgotten. And by the end of the 19th century, when the typical household was urban and its economic role mainly as a source of labor for businesses that had replaced it as the site of economic production, economists spoke abstractly of consumers and seldom, if ever, mentioned households. Consequently, notions of home and family, integral to pre-industrial agrarian understandings of the economy, disappeared from economic reckoning, as did any account of how household work, devalued as women's work, contributes to the larger economy. And I suggested that whether or not we have ever framed it this way, we all feel the dislocation of home and family as a center of economic production. And we struggle with the impacts on home and family of our present economic system. Today, I want to develop that point by exploring how we think about labor. Our ideas about labor combine notions from our own experience with images carried forward from pre-industrial agrarian times that sit uncomfortably in today's industrial economy and are a further source of confusion about work, home, and family. As I mentioned, the household's productive character was implicit in Adam Smith's writings. He didn't make explicit mention of it because it was so obvious in his pre-industrial agrarian world. Families produced to survive and sold their surplus if they had any. When he looked around at the 18th century economy, he saw many small producers, households, who competed to exchange surplus goods. That's what towns were for. They provided a market. He also looked around and saw a rather hard productive life and an uneven availability of goods. How could this quality of life be improved? His answer was by division of labor. Households were trying to produce every kind of good they needed. In each, a small group of people was making a diverse assortment of goods from scratch, employing a range of skills, using whatever materials were available on a production schedule that made it hard to master the required skills. No doubt there was already some specialization within a household. One member of the family had special gifts in some area and was either the in-house expert or had developed a trade as a craftsperson to help other families in need of their skill. But for most, such activity was a sideline. Now, suppose this sort of specialization were developed, not only according to where certain skills were available, but also according to where better raw materials were available. Instead of everyone trying to do as many productive things as possible, sometimes with inferior materials, everyone could trade for the things that were difficult for them to make themselves. Division of labor, to Smith, meant specialization in production and voluntary exchange of goods. And by this means, both economic production and the standard of living would rise. All would get better and more efficient at providing their specialty, and everyone could stop wasting their precious life energy trying to make inefficiently with inferior materials what others made more easily with better materials at hand. Smith thought this could work because by nature people are imaginative and sociable and care about each other's well-being, desiring to please them and averse to giving offense. On this basis, he believed people engaged in production, whether managers or workers, made rational, self-interested choices. Not calculating ones, but caring ones. That's what he thought was rational. He had qualms about such repetitive work as he saw because it could reduce the satisfactions of work and make it a misery. To compensate for any way that the division of labor lowered the standard of living, he advocated publicly funded universal education, which was sure to raise it. Smith was not so confident about people's choices as consumers, especially if they were wealthy. Consumers' choices, he thought, were often socially driven. influenced by their imaginings of others' perceptions of them, their desire in this world of sound and echo, figure and shadow, to make a favorable impression, to get sympathy, not pity, and to get along well and be friendly. Fashion and self-indulgence were dangers and impediments to consumers' capacity for rational choice, he thought. Perhaps universal education could help there too. Because he understood households as productive economic units, not merely as consumers the way we do today, Smith envisioned them exchanging goods they owned. Now, about a century before him, John Locke had worked out a theory of property and ownership in an economic framework regarding raw materials like land and the minerals under it and the plants that grew in it and the animals that live upon it as gifts of God to which one might have legal ownership. Locke theorized that when one produced something from these resources, one mixed one's labor with them. You put something of yourself into what you make, and thus make them proper to you. That is, they become your property, because your labor is in them. So, if you hire someone to work in your factory, how can the product of their labor become yours to sell? Locke's answer was because during the hours they work for you, their labor no longer belongs to them, but to you. You bought that labor from them with the wage you paid or owed them. Now, if the worker was your dependent child in those days or an enslaved person you owned, then their labor already was yours. Locke knew that. Though he never married or had children, he did serve as secretary of the Board of Trade and Plantations and as secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, experiences that shaped his economic ideas. The situation of adult wage laborers was less clear. Hobbes, just 10 years in the grave when Locke published his theory, had said that property rights must be determined by a political authority. So Locke defined property rights as derived not from state authority, but from natural law. Now, in our time, Judge Richard Posner, now retired, made his career as a legal scholar, arguing that the way to resolve any number of civil law cases was simply to assign property rights. A Hobbesian view, if there ever was one. He served 36 years on the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, delighting any number of corporations whose size Adam Smith would have shuddered to contemplate. Meanwhile, Marxists took up Locke's theory and argued that wage labor appropriated the laborer's inalienable property. After all, Locke himself said that everyone has property in themselves. You see how we pick and choose our ideas. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith famously illustrated division of labor with the example of a pin factory. That factory would have been an outbuilding on some household estate. And it wouldn't have been making pins to our way of thinking. In Smith's day, pins meant nails. He was thinking of, say, furniture building as a household specialty. Had he instead looked into what we think of as pins, he'd have had his attention drawn to the textile industry, one of the first economic activities to industrialize, and gotten a glimpse not only of how technology can make labor more productive, but also of how further specialization can organize production into what we now call supply chains. He might then have imagined that as engines and machines replaced animals in production processes and freed people for other activities, our interaction with such devices might affect how we interact with our neighbors or our employees. History, alas, is replete with missed opportunities. He understood that the division of labor meant increased interdependence, but I don't think he imagined the degree to which interdependence could generate dependencies and vast inequalities of wealth and power. He certainly saw the economic dangers of unequal power and wealth inequality. He opposed entails and other restrictions on the transfer of property. He opposed both government-granted monopolies and attempts by businesses to band together to force prices higher or wages lower. He wanted tight regulations on banking. And he favored equalizing measures, such as a progressive income tax and taxes on any kind of monopoly profit. He thought that if the government acted both to preserve the rule of law and to ensure that markets had many small-scale, more or less equal competitors, then more interdependence would improve everyone's standard of living. But those two things had to be there: the small units competing kind of market and the rule of law. But we have come to a pass where households sell labor to business firms on whose ledgers that labor is an expense. And most households sell nothing else. One of the defenses of slavery was that enslaved laborers were an asset on the plantation's books. That's a weak defense. But to the extent that an accounting convention can adjust an employer's attitude towards their worker, I would rather be considered an asset than an expense, wouldn't you? And maybe that treatment on the books does account for treatment at the work site and the need for a labor movement to advocate for 8-hour workday and child labor laws and other kinds of regulations. So, the question, what and whom do we work for, has layers of meaning. What do we work for? Money? Yes. A living? Yes. By a living, do we mean more than money? I think the answer to that is also yes. Within our consumer households, we work towards certain goals we have for our lives. The money we earn by selling our labor supports our pursuit of personal goals. It's nice when the work we do for money also contributes to goals we believe in, aligns with our values, or even furthers our personal goals. But many find their employer's goals in tension with the values they try to live by, or find that the time and energy given to paid work leaves little available to pursue their personal goals. What do we work for? And whom do we work for? That is, to whom are we accountable? Again, there are layers of meaning. About 20 years ago, when we Unitarian Universalists had our last major round of angst about our late lamented principles, anxiously asking ourselves, what is at the center of our faith? I was present at a clergy study retreat where my colleague David Bumbaugh read a moving paper in which he argued that this was the wrong question. Instead, he said we should be asking, whom do we serve? Not what's at the center of our faith, but whom do we serve? And then he told a story about growing up in a family who would have been regarded by their neighbors as poor white trash, whose lives gained little material reward, and who, when they went to the grocery store and saw the sign on the door that said welcome, they knew it wasn't meant for them. And so they attended a church whose message was that they were loved, that offered hope of a spiritual reward. They were whom that church served. And then he asked us to reflect on our Unitarian Universalist message of hope in the journey and love in community, and suggested that they whom we serve are the emergent middle class, mobile on a journey, leaving their past behind them, and so on. I feel sure there's more to us than that, but it made quite an impression to consider our faith through that lens. I think our new cluster of 6 values centered on love suggests a more expansive answer, that we are accountable to all our neighbors to explore and live out and to act in service to justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity to the best of our ability. Because, vine and branch, we are connected in this world of sound and echo, figure and shadow, the leaves contingent, roots pushing against earth, an apple, a household, belongs to itself, to stem and tree, to air that claims it, then ground. Connections balance. Each motion changes another. Precarious, hanging together. We don't know what our lives support, and we touch in the least shift of breathing. Each holy thing is borrowed. Everything depends. It is in the nature of life that everything depends, is contingent, is connected. Everything depends and belongs. May we live into that truth. Amen.
I invite our chalice lighter, Valerie Pearsall, my dear wife of 35 plus years, to extinguish our chalice. Please join us in saying our closing words, which are in the order of service. Go out
to
the world
in
in peace,
have courage,
hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings.
And may you remember that everything depends and belongs.